All right, so we'll go ahead and officially get started. Welcome everyone to the Global Frailty Network Frailty Seminar Series. I am Sarah Espinoza. I'm a geriatrician and clinical investigator, and I am currently at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where I am now the director of the new Center for Translational Geroscience. Our inaugural speaker for the 2023-2024 year for the Frailty Seminar Series is Dr. Jeremy Walston. Before I introduce him, we have a few housekeeping issues. I'd like to remind you about our Global Frailty Network, which is a group of healthcare professionals and researchers dedicated to studying frailty. And we started the Frailty Seminar Series in 2021 with the goal of exchanging and sharing evidence-based practices and research advances about all aspects of frailty. Our Frailty Seminar Series in 2023 to 2024 year will present a lineup of renowned speakers from all around the world, sharing their expertise, experiences in the rapidly growing field of frailty. As we get started, for any questions you may have for the speaker, please enter them into the chat box, and then we will get to as many as we can at the end of the talk. If you are a clinician practicing in the US or Canada, you can claim AMA PRA credits. You will receive instructions about this at the end of the seminar. Now I'll introduce Dr. Walston. Dr. Jeremy Walston is a pioneer and leader in the field of frailty and geriatrics. He is the Raymond and Anna Lublin Professor of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology at Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions. He is the director of the Johns Hopkins Older Americans Independence Center and the Johns Hopkins Human Aging Project. He's also deputy director of the Division of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology at Johns Hopkins. His research focuses on determining the biological characteristics that promote resilience and healthy aging, and on translation of that knowledge into diagnostic, preventive, and treatment strategies for the goal of promoting a long and healthy life. Today, he will be speaking to us about the relationship between frailty and resiliency. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Walston.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to hear from you. Nice to be on the group and to start the year off. You guys have done a great job in organizing this symposium and bringing people in from all over the world. So thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to mention that in the last couple of weeks, I've had a number of clinical calls with people who are doing medical practice for older adults and mostly subspecialists thinking about how to care for older adults and prevent them from having bad outcomes from their procedures and surgeries and specific treatments. So it just makes me think of the importance of the work that we're all doing and what we're thinking about in keeping older adults healthy and vibrant and not especially frail and able to do things, late in life. And I think also the news media recently, we've seen so much information about President Biden and his, age, and Mitch McConnell, who is a senator in the U.S., who recently had a couple medical issues that made a lot of people doubt his abilities. Even former President Trump and his age, these things come up constantly. And I think as people who work in this area, we really need to be thoughtful about protecting older adults and thinking about ways to maximize their abilities and prevent them from becoming frail and from having and make them become more resilient and able to tolerate stressors. So this is a slide from that I put together. It was, I think, last spring or last fall. And just two older adults. And at this point, the Queen who died shortly after this picture, I brought this up just to say like how important it was. She was in her late 90s, and 2 or 3 days before she died, she actually was meeting with the new Prime Minister of England. So, keeping that as sort of our ideals in clinical practice and the research we do to keep people healthy and ongoing up to the, till the very end is a great thing to do. And thanks to you all for working on that. And also Nancy Pelosi, who was the Speaker of the House in the U.S., also continued to be incredibly vital and have input into, I think she's now, 84. So just thinking about that and thinking about ways to keep people from becoming frail, keeping them resilient is important. So this is a picture of some of my relatives who lived to be over 100. They were married for more than 77 years. And I used to ask them a lot about what they wanted as they became older. And they wanted to keep high energy levels, have good health, and avoid chronic diseases and constant medical care. They hated going to doctors. They liked their doctors, but they didn't like to go. Um, they had an ability, they wanted to be able to bounce back quickly from illness. They wanted to live independently. They wanted to have clear thinking with no dementia and enjoy social contacts and meaningful activities. So that's all sort of preventing frailty and keeping resilient and engaged in their lives. This slide shows the ages that we often are thinking about and trying to help people in. So in geriatrics, at least, you see here the average rate of death, age of death is usually in the mid to late 80s. It's probably decreased a bit with COVID, but in general, what happens to people in the years before they die, they begin to have functional decline, maybe get more frail. And this kind of pinkish area, I think, is where we really focus on. We were trying to find some of the basic biologic changes that are happening that are making people more frail and less resilient as they move towards mortality. This is another way that we've looked at these or think about it, sort of big picture thoughts and what we're trying to do. And, out here would be a frail person with very, becoming disabled and a low threshold of doing well, and a non-frail or very resilient person that has not become disabled, even though they may be hitting 95 or 80, 85. But sort of more in the adult life. And I think more and more we're going to be looking into this. People begin to have some separation, really, sometimes even in adolescence, in their health and maintenance of ability to respond to stressors. Younger people in general are resilient after an acute illness. But there are some differences, and trying to figure out what those systems are that make people different as they get older is going to be increasingly important. So I just wanted to highlight that, and some of the things I'm going to be talking about are thinking about differences. We see that when people are older and frail, we've been able to identify the biologic differences out here because they're so different than other older people. But in this midlife area, I think we're going to increasingly need to identify what those differences are and how to best keep people pushed up towards this green line as they age. So goals for frailty and resiliency research. First, really what we try to do is promote resiliency, which is the ability to respond to stressors, and especially kind of severe, either medical or injury kinds of stressors. Also to have function and cognition in older adults, promote that, and then reduce frailty and the accumulation of chronic disease states. So that's really what we're trying to do. And I think the biologic measures that we've come up with are beginning to help inform that. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about the conceptualization of the study of physical frailty and physical resilience and sort of the similarities and the differences. Talk about the biologic characteristics of physical frailty and resilience that we've come up with. And at the very end, talk a little bit about next steps. So this is a sort of a slide that shows the conceptual framework of frailty and the vulnerability and lack of resilience. And you see in frailty, when we say the word frailty, there's all these things that kind of swirl around it: disability and physical impairment, old age, comorbidity and disease states, and then this cognitive impairment. And all of these things are swirling around as people age. And it's often difficult to kind of come up with a clear definition. Lots of people in the field of frailty research are working on this and coming up with definitions. And we certainly have had one of these. This slide shows the two major conceptualizations, I think, of frailty. And on the left, you see this physical frailty, which we have thought of as a very basic physiologic and biologic change that is detectable by things like muscle strength loss, low energy levels, walking speed, weight loss, and physical activity. And on the right, you see the cumulative deficit frailty or frailty index, which is often thought of as an assembly of changes that have happened and adding up to make somebody frail or oftentimes functional in severe functional decline or other issues. So these two things are very conceptually different. And I think I will spend most of the time talking about physical frailty and this underlying biology that is in the center of that blue dot here, and that's driving the things that we detect frailty with, rather than the sort of comorbidities that are often part of this cumulative deficit or index frailty. So if you look at the complexity of physical frailty in the background, this is some of the work that people in our group and really around the country and world have done to help us think about it. So out here, we know that frailty, physical frailty, is a high risk clinical entity, then high risk for bad outcomes like physical dependence, disability, worsening chronic disease states, cognitive decline, and early mortality. People who are frail are much more likely to die in the next 2 or 3 years after that than people who are not frail. And over the years, we've been thinking about our clinically apparent ability to detect those. And we have a frailty phenotype exam that's one of the gold standards of frailty measurement, physical frailty or frailty phenotype, that has some measurements that help us find frail people and robust people who are the opposite. Sorry about that. And in the physiology area, we've over time come up with these major changes in physiology that are different between frail and non-frail people. And these are chronic inflammation, HPA axis activity, sympathetic nervous system, angiotensin system activity, low levels of energy production, and altered hormones. And if you look at these things, these are really sort of stress response systems. They shouldn't be turned on unless there's really a lot of stress there. And what we find in frail people is that they're often just kind of left on in a chronic way. And that tends to drive a lot of other changes that are happening out here and making diseases worse, contributing cognition and function, et cetera. So ultimately, though, there are things that are triggering this, right? So for aging, for older people, there are many molecular changes, and there's like hallmarks of aging that are increasingly available to read about in the literature. Things about mitochondria, senescent cells, autophagy, DNA methylation. These things are happening as people age, and they probably end up triggering some of these stress response system changes. We also know that many chronic diseases that people develop, especially if they're poorly controlled, things like depression, heart failure, I think would be a big one. Some cancers that are probably undetected, but driving some inflammatory changes. Chronic infections, things like HIV certainly turn some of these systems on. And then over time, drive the muscle-related changes and the ultimate vulnerability to these outcomes. Importantly, there are some gene variants that will drive some of these changes and push towards frailty, but we haven't found a lot of them. But environmental and sort of lifestyle things really do make a difference here. So probably poor diets, poor levels of activity, poverty, lack of education seem to drive people quicker into this network of problems. So our group tends to look at the biology and think about disease states that drive this, but increasingly, I think the field and our group and other groups should be looking at these environmental changes, racial differences, et cetera, that we think really um, are make people more activated in these systems earlier in life and driving them towards frailty and poor outcomes. So this is another image that we use to help describe the biology of frailty, and this you'll see the importance of this as when I turn my attention to resiliency in a minute. So this is sort of the outline of clinical um, of research in frailty that we've done, and we've often thought of frailty is something that there's some clinical apparentness, right? So we can diagnose frailty with that screening exam that I told about, with weakness, low activity, slow gait, fatigue, and weight loss being the major components of that. So we can see that and say, okay, that person's frail, that person's non-frail. And along with that, there's some labs that we draw in clinical practice that might help predict some of these things. So anemia that's not related to iron deficiency, low levels of cholesterol and albumin, maybe some mild clotting factors. Sometimes folks are a little bit cognitively impaired. They may not get all the way to AD, Alzheimer's disease, but these things we see in clinical practice and make us aware that that person is going to be more vulnerable for bad outcomes and less resilient ultimately. So this slide then below the surface shows us of this, this kind of intense biology that's happening that we don't see, we don't really have lab measurements for. Hopefully over time, this stuff will become part of what we do to help prevent frailty and maintain resiliency in older adults. But I'll use glucose intolerance here as an impact. We do that in clinical practice, but oftentimes people who are frail are mildly glucose intolerant. They have some altered energy systems changes. We're getting more and more specific about what those things are, but I'd say energy metabolism and some of the endocrine changes are important and hopefully will be increasingly used in clinical practice. The stress response systems, which are very important in resiliency research, and I'll talk about that in a minute, are often off base in people who are frail. So increased inflammation, more response to stressors, high levels of cortisol in this HPA axis, high levels of sort of autonomic nervous system activity that doesn't get shut off and doesn't get turned down. So these things just get turned on and start getting more and more promoted. Same with energy systems. And then ultimately, there are these deeply organized molecular changes, mitochondria that probably drive inflammation, and cell senescence, which also is pushing some of these changes. So, we have all these little pieces that we study, and many people in biologic and aging research look at individual components here. But ultimately, I think we know that all of these things could be making a difference. They're pushing people towards frailty and poor outcomes. And they're probably very different between people. One 80-year-old might be quite different and have very different problems on these maps that would make them more frail. And the other person might have, stem cell exhaustion and epigenetic changes that are driving it. And one might have mitochondria and inflammation that are driving it. So I think over time, we hope to be able to become more specific and precise about what individuals have and how to make an ultimate decision on if somebody's heading towards frailty or if they're going to maintain their resiliency. So the next slide, I'm going to kind of turn a little bit now towards resiliency and this conceptualization of frailty and resiliency and the physiologic overlap. So underlying hypothesis that Chen-Li Zhu and others have had over time is that resilient physiologic systems are able to maintain equilibrium in the face of stressors. Loss of reserve in these systems leads to biological vulnerability and physical frailty. So the end result here is frailty, and that's different. It's not really the opposite of resiliency. It's just kind of the end result of lack of resiliency. So this is a nice figure that says, in people's lives all the time, they're just a bunch of stressors, right? It could be a physical stressor, it could be an emotional stressor, and these things tend to make people's physiologic systems bend a bit, but then they come back to normal, right? So if you're young, especially, you may have some bad things happen, but people tend to bounce back. But as they accumulate over time, people start having lower abilities to bounce back, right? These stressors, people aren't always coming back up. And I think those of us in clinical practice in geriatric medicine see that all the time, right? People hit a wall and then they drop down and they never get back up to where they were. And then the next time they're not doing very well at all. They don't maybe recover at all. So at some point they hit the stressor line of frailty and have difficulty getting there. So this is just one of the conceptualizations that I think is important to recognize. These stressors and the response to stressors are really key to resiliency. And I'll talk more about that. And ultimately, you get down towards frailty if you're not resilient. So some of the theories of resiliency that have been put in over time, you'll see there's definitely some similarities to frailty. This maintenance of complexity, in frailty, that complexity seems to be going away. And the homeostatic regulation that I showed, there are many variants there in frailty that are related to frailty. And so these things need to kind of stay in place if you're going to be resilient. And ultimately, they're keeping your systems, your stress response systems integral and intact, and making somebody resilient or able to respond to stressors, respond appropriately. So lots of people have written about this, and they wrote about frailty and resiliency in the past. So resiliency is the ability to rebound from stressors is something a paper back in '92 Buchner and Wagner wrote, and we got a lot of our early physical frailty activities from that. And it's a capacity to withstand stress, right? This ability to rebound. Resiliency is a maintenance of complexity. Also, these systems that I'm talking about, these biologic, intensely physiologic stress response systems are very complex, interactive. And, as long as they're intact, people tend to get better, unless it's such a severe illness or injury that they can't overcome that. Complexity of homeostatic mechanisms are important, the sort of reactive tuning, and then this loss of complexity ultimately leads to this vulnerability. Homeostatic regulation, Luigi Ferrucci, Linda Fried, and Gwen Wyndham have written about this, and other people as well, but there's a nice paper that sort of talked about that and how that's important in frailty, and loss of that leads to frailty. And many of these things are the work that we and others have done on frailty have helped to kind of back this up as important kind of underlying theories that are both important to frailty and to maintaining resiliency. So biologic premises that feed both. So age-related changes in molecular and physiologic systems provide a platform for vulnerability to frailty. We know that, and probably less resilience. So there's a kind of a platform of change there. And it's responsive to basically not being very responsive to stressors, right? These systems are kind of gradually going downhill. Sorry, my slides keep moving here. So gradually accelerates before manifesting in clinical signs or symptoms. And the same stress response systems that impact frailty are hypothesized to impact resiliency to stressors, as I've talked about. And I'll show you some figures on that. Responses to specific stressors to identify relevant biologic changes are important. Need the sort of wide variability in outcomes if we're going to look at physical stressors, right? So if somebody has a procedure done, for example, some people do really well, some people do really poorly, and a lot of people kind of come out in the middle. And you need, in order to look at the biology that's driving resiliency or defining resiliency, you need to have these variabilities in outcome. And then the use of static and dynamic measures may help capture these biological strands and that define resiliency in the face of different types of stressors. Okay, now, one of the major groups that have worked on resiliency over time is the Duke Older Americans Independence Center. Heather Woodson has also been a major kind of player in helping to think through this. And several years ago, she wrote, I think, an important paper along with her colleagues from Duke that's in the American Geriatric Society Journal that talks about physical resilience. And basically the title was Physical Resilience, Not Simply the Opposite of Frailty. And I think it's important to recognize that. I'm not like a frailty on our physical exam. There's frailty, and then there's a robust group, and then there's a sort of intermediate pre-frail. And we don't necessarily use stressors to find those people. We just use those measurements. So those people are, frail people are probably not very resilient, but it's hard to know with the other people unless you're actually measuring some of the stressors and stress responses. So in this paper, they talked about resilience as being a continuous spectrum that applies across the lifespan. Frailty is there at the advanced age, but earlier, there's all sorts of resilience responses that happen in middle-aged people and younger people as well. Resilience response is measured at one or more time points after a stressor, and I mentioned that already. It's really important if you're going to try to capture resilience measures that you're looking at what their outcomes are long-term after a big stressor, right? You kind of have to find the stressor and then, check it a week after, a month after, 2 months after, 6 months after, especially if they're big illnesses or big injuries or big surgeries, for example. And then the mechanisms may differ in driving decline, frailty, for example, versus improvement after stress or resiliency. And as we get into a little bit more biology, I'll tell you about that. Frailty is low intrinsic capacity with low physiologic reserve and limited stress responsibility. So that's kind of a conceptual framework that makes resiliency and frailty different. In this paper, they describe something as a castle under siege, which I think is really kind of important. If imagine a castle in the Crusade era being attacked on the and some of them were overrun, some of them weren't, and there's all kinds of things. As people age, there's changes in the castle that might allow the siege to overcome and get inside and completely damage and destroy the individual. But it also, there are many little things that might be protective, and there might be resources hidden inside the castle that we don't really know about that are preventing people from really, or stressors from really attacking the individual. So it's a really nice paper that kind of points out some of the differences here. And then importantly, the use of static and dynamic measures may help capture biological strands that define resiliency in the face of different types of stressors. So again, it's important to kind of think about these dynamical systems that help you capture some of these things and how people are responding. The people who don't respond and do poorly are probably frail, right? So there is a close relationship between frailty and resilience, but lots of people are in that kind of intermediate range where frailty isn't really going to help you figure out if they're resilient or not, or those other kind of pre-frail or other robust situations. Some of those people may actually be quite not resilient as well, but that's why these other systems I think are important. Okay, so the Duke OAC conceptual model for frailty was published in 2022 in a journal called Journal of Frailty and Aging. So there is definitely a response, and you see, I think Importantly, there's this dynamic response in the middle with a lot of different ranges. We know that, as I said, that in order to measure these things, there have to be some stressors, some specific stressors. And then there's a lot of thought about what the reserve is getting there. And then, by looking at the outcomes over time, you can decide which of these problems is, or which of the dynamical systems in here are making somebody resilient or not resilient. They also put a figure in the paper about this was a fracture. So again, the stressor here was fracture, and are there some biomarkers associated with it? And there was a theory that high resilience is those with low cellular senescence, low inflammation, high mitochondrial function, and improved skeletal muscle metabolism. Those who had low resilience might have increased senescence, high inflammation, low mitochondrial function, and low skeletal muscle function. So again, you see some of these are similar to what we see in frailty research. And a lot of the measures that we and others in the Duke group are doing are kind of in line with that. But again, looking at it in response to a big stressor event. So we at Hopkins also have been doing resilience research for a number of years. We got a nice grant funded several years ago entitled Characterizing Resiliencies to Physical Stressors in Older Adults, a Dynamical Physiologic Systems Approach. And it's called the Spring Study. In that study, we have a cohort of people getting bone marrow transplants. So, a really big stressor, which is, basically both on chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and then a cell transplant. And this was about 120 people. Ready is a subset of people, older people undergoing dialysis for the first time. So imagine hemodialysis is a big stressor, getting hooked up to a machine and having your blood come out and put back in. And then finally Restore, which is a knee replacement population. So that's also a stressor. And you can see they're all very different stressors. And by doing this, we're hoping to be able to identify the biologic systems that are most intact and help people. And so similar to the conceptual framework that you saw from the Duke group, ours, we just have put a lot more kind of information in this framework. But the capacity here of resilience ultimately is this green arrow. And what is it? We're trying to figure it out. We know that to find things in resiliency, you have to stress people, right? You're going to get a big boom here, and those three things that we talked about in our studies are there. This is related to the knee replacement surgery. So we know they're getting anesthesia, they're getting surgery, and then we can see what happens to them over time. So we see their phenotypes and their outcomes, so we can follow them for a few weeks, and then again in a month, and then 3 months and 6 months, and we see how they recover in their trajectory. Some of them are going to be great and do really well and resilient, and other people are going to do poorly. And in the bone marrow transplant, many people die, right? So you get this like downstream impact, and other people survive and are doing great, and a lot of people are kind of treading water and not doing fantastic. But so in order to begin to look at the biology, we have come up with a lot of different measures. And again, this closely related to frailty. And in frailty research, over time, what we found is that people who are frail have changes in their glucose tolerance. They're frail people are much less glucose tolerant. They have high levels of cortisol. They have a massive inflammatory response to things like LPS, and they have really big changes in their heart rate variability, which is related to the autonomic nervous system. So we know that these things are different, and we hypothesize that people who are getting studied for resilience are going to have off dynamic stimulation tests, right? They're not going to recover very well. And this is before they get their clinical stressors. So we hypothesize that we would find people who are resilient or not, and be able to predict them based on these results of these studies that we're doing before they get their big stressor and here. So that's why that's here. We also think that by measuring frailty and the phenotype of frailty and some levels of fatigue, we can also get clues as to who might be resilient and who aren't resilient. We know there's lots of biologic contributors up here. Things like age and psychosocial issues, health behaviors, disease states, and then that aging molecular stuff that I said also is related to frailty. We think that that contributes to this capacity of being resilient or not. And but that we can maybe detect those in these studies. So again, you see here the measures that we put together beforehand, and then the people get their procedures, and then we follow them for 6 months. And we're in the process now of measuring all of these things, and we'll be able to see if any of these are predictive of resilience or not, and how they're related to frailty ultimately. Again, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of these things have been identified in frail people. Again, high levels of cortisol over a 24-hour period are highly associated with frailty. People who are poorly glucose tolerant, even the very early studies we did back in the early 2000s, people with high levels of glucose and insulin at baseline or in oral glucose tolerance tests are much more likely to be frail, even if they're not diabetic. Heart rate variability, again, their hearts tend to just kind of pump at this static level. They don't tend to go up and down in response to stressors. So that kind of gets them probably into trouble. We know that happens in frailty. And then Sean Lang and others did a study on looking at immune system cells and stimulating them with LPS, which is a bacterial cell thing that basically triggers inflammation. And we know that in frail people, they have these massive responses to LPS. And so we're hypothesizing the same dynamic system would probably influence resiliency or lack of resiliency as well. So this is the other aging related contributes to resilience capacity in this sort of geroscience domain. And so what we're looking at chronic inflammation, which is important in frailty, T cell phenotypes, which will help us, identify who can respond to stress well and who can't. Physical properties of cells. We have a collaborator in the engineering school that's working on that. And then things like DNA methylation, the aging clock, the biologic clocks and things like that we're also looking at. Rehan Westbrook and Peter Abadir and others in our group have been looking at metabolomic measurements in frailty for for quite a while, and helping to define not just they're glucose intolerant, but thinking about the TCA cycle as well, and how glucose is broken down. So here's glucose, and there's development of ATP, and you get to pyruvate, which then gets into the TCA cycle. So we're trying to really explore in great detail what some of these variations are. We know that they're different in frail compared to non-frail. This was a great paper published in last year. So I just put that out there to let you know that we're trying to look at more precise measurements and bottlenecks of where the energy is going to be in a bottleneck or maybe progress normally. And we're also going to try to do that in resiliency. This is related to frailty, but we think that these stressors are going to impact these pathways in different ways, and some people just aren't going to have the energy to be able to respond to the stressors very well. So I think that's going to be increasingly important. We talked briefly about these age-related contributors to resilience, capacity and senescent cell markers, mitochondrial changes, and these things are also going to be really important. So just wanted to highlight that these things are actually happening very actively. The Duke group has a big study that is ending shortly. So I think, we're going to be able to really talk about these measures, how they're related to frailty, and how they're ultimately related to resiliency, and hopefully, in the end, be able to step into preventive strategies in people who are, middle-aged and early elderly before they head into late life frailty, and help us figure out how to prevent some of the changes that are happening to them. So in closing, I know we'll have a little time for questions. I wanted to just talk about what's next in the field. So again, our group and Duke Group have this big knee replacement area that we're working on. We'll have a lot of data coming out of that, new dialysis and bone marrow transplant as well, where these we'll see which of these systems are good in resilience and which of them are kind of in high variation. Some of them are going to be related to frailty as well, and some not. So hopefully we'll have some great new information on that. We're going to look at the relationship between baseline biological, clinical, and psychological variables in these outcomes. And then finally, this development of models that facilitate better understanding of interactions between responses and stress response systems in older adults. So again, things like these major systems that, we talk about a little bit in medicine, but we don't really measure them unless they're kind of people are sick with some endocrinology condition. So hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis, that's that sort of fight or flight instinct. We think that those systems are really, really important in responding to stressors. And so I think more and more work will be done in those areas, looking at differences and when people get turned on and stay on, I think is going to be increasingly important. Autonomic nervous system is something that really seems to change as people age, and there's more autonomic signaling and less parasympathetic signaling, and it doesn't get people don't have this kind of big response where their heart rates go down when they're calm and it goes up when they're excited. They just kind of stay on and stay up and just boom, 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 boom. And over time that makes them less responsive to stressors, and they don't do as well. So hopefully we'll have more information in that. And then these whole energy glucose metabolism systems, again, they're not one single marker, but I think we're going to be able to come up with some more precise ways to measure that, and also inflammatory pathway activation and changes, getting better and better at honing in on signals that are identified with people becoming frail, but also will help us identify the responses in those systems and who's going to be resilient because they have good responses in those systems. Interventions will be based on these biologic discoveries that promote resiliency in the face of clinical stressors. So if we can find these systems that are poorly regulated as people age, hopefully we'll be able to figure out ways to keep them, in middle age, from kind of drifting into these situations where they can't respond to stress. And then finally, development of different care plans for individuals who might have poor resilience. So in geriatrics, a lot of what we do is, it's not focused on healthy aging. It's like, because what the people we see in the medical practice are often sick, right? They have trouble maintaining good health. They have poor responses to some stressor that has come along, and they're not doing very well. So I think having better care plans for them is going to be really important. And then hopefully, again, figuring out ways to prevent, to improve their potential for resilience to stressors, and look at good outcomes after procedures, for example. So those are kind of big picture things that we and many other groups in the U.S. and around the world are thinking about. I think it really is important, again, that we continue to provide leadership in these fields and try to get more and more precise on some of these biologic measurements so that we can guide the field better. So with that, I'll acknowledge our Older Americans Independence Center. It's an NIH grant, our physical resiliency grant as well, and then other studies we've done on the chronic inflammation great group of folks at Hopkins and really from around the country that join our group. I would encourage anybody who would like to join this. It happens every other Wednesday, the second and fourth Wednesday of the month at 9 a.m. We have this big call, basically, and we talk about frailty and some of the new ways to measure frailty, but also do some of these biologic studies and set up clinical practices that will support people. And we welcome people to join that from anywhere around the world. And finally, the spring study team, that was a huge resiliency study. We're kind of coming to the end of it now, but a great group of people, both clinicians and research scientists and staff members have made a huge difference in that. So with that, I will end. Thank the organizers for doing this and go from there.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions in the chat. The first is, what do you think, it's from Ellie Moros. What do you think about rehabilitative potential and physical resilience? Could it be the same, or physical resilience could help us to consider whether a person has favorable rehabilitative potential or not in the hospital?
Yeah, I think that some of those systems are going to be really important. That's what I was trying to kind of articulate, that we don't have great measures of some of them yet. And I do think, like, even in primary care, we probably, I'd say maybe age, I guess 50 is when really, there's much less success sometimes in surgeries and responses are down. So I think that by learning good measurements of those systems, if there's something for HPA axis, for example, or this autonomic nervous system that I do think is increasingly recognized, that we can probably improve them. There's maybe no cure, but I think even just exercise, and I don't know, there may be some ways to keep the sympathetic nervous system from becoming this overwhelming power and kind of keep parasympathetic nervous system in place. And that's going to make a big difference for rehab, right? If people can bounce back, those systems are going to have to be there. Just a observation. I used to run the rehab unit in geriatrics here years ago. I was a medical director of that unit. And I think one of the things that drove me into this field is that there was a subset of people, that were lovely, sweet, older people that just, no matter what we did in rehab, they didn't get better, right? Whereas their next door neighbor was the same age and, they kind of bounced back and went home and, went back to Florida or California or whatever for the winter, or traveled with their families. And, ultimately, I think it was some of these poor responses of these stress responses. Well, mostly we thought about inflammation back then, and we couldn't get it shut down, but also probably HPA axis and other things. And so I think it really is going to matter, but we still, unfortunately, don't know how to put that in clinical practice. So I would encourage all of you to help think about that and, kind of help lead the field in getting some of those measurements out there.
Great. Okay, another question from Victoria Ramos Barragan. Thank you for a great talk. Where would you put the vitality capacity concept in this algorithm?
Vitality concept.
Capacity, yeah.
I guess, Jeremy, let me interject just to, I think vitality, I think is one of the 5 components of intrinsic capacity. And when you read the description or the concept from the World Health Organization, it shares a lot of the same characteristics that you describe when describing resilience, even the biomolecular factors like senescence and inflammation. So I guess that's what she's referring to.
And so just ask the question again, I'm sorry.
Where would you put the vitality capacity concept in this algorithm? I guess in the algorithm of resiliency and frailty, or?
Yeah, I think, that is definitely, there's a lot of overlap. We haven't really thought about it, but I think, in that middle diagram, that conceptual framework, there are definitely places that some of that could be incorporated, and we should. That conceptual framework is used to help us think about some of the measurements and how to frame them. I mean, I think early in my career, I've often just focused on like one or two little things, like IL-6, for example, right? Or glucose intolerance. But ultimately, and those in population studies were great, because then you said, oh, this is associated with bad outcomes. And so it helped us discover which of the pathways were most important. But ultimately, I think the complexity of individuals is such that we can't say that every person is going to be exactly the same. If they have this thing wrong with them, they're going to end up doing poorly. There's like two or three things. And so those bigger conceptual frameworks now help us put some of those measurements in place. So thinking about the aging biologic changes, the dynamic system changes, the stress, the family situations that keep stabbing the stressor systems of people, or not, or calming them, right? So I think there's a way to think about that, and I welcome input as to how to help correlate with the ICOPE stuff that people have been working on with the kind of more basic biologic and physiologic stuff we've been doing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think George's response was probably better than mine.
That's good. Okay, and then one question that's important is, how can I join, or how can we join the Frailty Working Group?
Yes. I don't know if Brian Buddha is on here. He's our program coordinator. If you send him an email,
Let me see if I can find it. Okay.
Yeah, and just say you'd like to join, and then we can just add you to our email list of times and dates that we miss and agendas. And we really welcome people talking. We have people from all over the country and world kind of talking to us about it. We also have a very basic biology of healthy aging group that meets every Tuesday that is mostly frail related to. So if you're in a more biologic realm, that would be very helpful as well. Helpful to us and helpful, hopefully helpful to you. We provide good thoughts about it. There's Brian. Brian, sorry. Brian will probably get 100 emails today. And it's like,
yeah,
Dr. Walston, stop it. No.
You'll have a lot of people at your next meeting.
No, we do welcome people joining. It's been I think that's where we really have a lot of fun, just feeling like we're pulling people together, and they're helping us, we're helping them kind of move the field forward and take better care of older people. So
that's great. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr. Walston. Really outstanding talk, and thanks Al for joining. This will wrap up our inaugural webinar for 2023-24. Please join us on October 11th for our next webinar, where Dr. Anne Hendry from the International Foundation for Integrated Care Scotland, Hub UK, will present integrated care for frailty. And remember, if you are a clinician in the US or Canada, you can claim continuing medical education credits, and you'll receive instructions at the end of the webinar. Thanks again, Dr. Walston, for your talk.
Yeah. I just saw a comment come through. I just want to say the resiliency study we did, we published the overview. It came out in the Journal of American Geriatric Society in June or July. So it is there if you guys want to look at that. Some of the figures I presented are there. But also in closing, I just wanted to thank the organizers of this webinar. It's just been a wonderful worldly, kind of event. And thank you so much for including me and for making this happen for people around the world. So thank you.